This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 7. Chapter 13. McCoy got dressed and went in to work. He wasn't going to sleep anyway. Might as well be productive somewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Jillian. When she said illegal, she'd meant herself. She was here in the U.S. illegally. He enforced the law. Sure, his area of authority didn't extend to what she was doing wrong, but the whole idea went against his personal code of honor. There were a ton of rules that he didn't like, yet every single day he enforced them. Some of them didn't make any sense. Why did a person have to be a citizen to have a permit to house an elephant anyway? What did it matter? But a rule was a rule. You couldn't break them just because you didn't agree with them. He knew that. He believed that. He lived that. Except now he was torn. Did knowing that Jillian wasn't here legally make him complicit in her crime? Or maybe more accurately, did Jillian breaking the law to be here make him want to be with her less? Was there something wrong with him because he didn't care? He couldn't believe that he'd gotten to that point, that he didn't care that every day she was breaking the law of the country he loved just to be here. He hadn't known that his feelings were growing that strong. But he wasn't a slave to his feelings. Never had been. He had never allowed himself to be ruled by how he felt. He lived by an outside moral code that didn't change according to his inside volatile feelings. Sure, it was a harder way to live, but even now, when his heart begged him to do something different, he knew it was the right way. But the right action? He wasn't sure. He was also bound by his word. He'd told her she could touch him any time. She'd tested that today, and she knew his struggle. Maybe that was why she'd walked away. He also couldn't say for sure that if he'd been born in Mexico that he wouldn't be trying as hard as he could to get into the U.S. Actually, no, he knew he wouldn't. He'd be trying as hard as he could to make his birth country a better place. But maybe that was a product of where he'd been born and raised. He'd be a completely different person if he'd been born in Mexico. All of these thoughts, plus his jumbled-up feelings of want and desire for Jillian, were zapping through his body, so he wasn't prepared for the shock he got when he walked in the office. Loretta motioned him back to Louie's office. "Just go in," she said. He'd texted Louie, so his boss knew he was coming. "Hey, come on in," Louie said as McCoy pushed the door open. Somehow he'd known Todd would be in there too. He walked in, feeling weary and heavy, like his skin was made out of lead. "We have a solution to the elephant problem." Louie glanced at Todd, who sat in the chair in front of the desk with a big smirk on his face. McCoy had thought he'd been through all the emotion he could handle for one day, but anxiety cramped his stomach. Whatever was going to be said next would affect Jillian. He needed to protect her. Whatever the confusion surrounding his feelings for her, he knew that much. "Todd has found a buyer at a zoo out west. Their last elephant died of old age, and they want this one." Louie watched McCoy carefully. "I've also decided to relieve you of the elephant inspection duty. I think Todd's right, and you're a little too emotionally involved." Plus, you're on that cockfighting ring that you were called out for last night. I want to see that report, by the way. But in the meantime, I'm giving the elephant case to Todd." Todd shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "We already have several complaints. If she's out of compliance even once, we can confiscate the animal and sell it to the zoo. You know what an elephant sells for?" Todd's brows lifted, indicating it was a huge sum of money. "You can't make things up." McCoy's voice was devoid of the emotions that wanted to erupt out of his chest. "I won't need to." They both knew that there were so many regulations that it was almost impossible to follow every single one. Normally, they'd give a verbal warning and give an owner time to fix any problems, even though they weren't required to by law. There isn't a thing out of place in her boarding kennel or in the elephant pen. He couldn't protest being taken off Jillian's case. There was no way he could argue that he wasn't emotionally involved. But if Todd was going to go in there and take Heidi over some obscure infraction, it wasn't right, and everyone in the room knew it. "The case is out of your hands," Louis said. "Let it go." His eyes said that if McCoy couldn't allow this to fade out, it would only prove what Todd had been arguing all along, that McCoy was too emotionally involved to have been doing a good job on the case. "Is that all you wanted?" McCoy asked. "Yes." "I'll go get that report from last night written." He turned and left, closing the door carefully behind him when what he really wanted to do was slam it. It didn't bode well for his chances of getting the promotion if he was being removed from a case and Todd was being reassigned. That almost never happened. It would hit him soon, he was sure, but currently he didn't really care if he got the promotion or not. Everything he believed had been called into question, and he wasn't sure where to turn to figure out where he was. By lunch, the report was finished. He turned it in before leaving for the day. His first thought was that he'd go out to Jillian's, but he no longer had a reason to. He needed to warn her about Todd, but Todd was headed out east for the rest of the week, so he wouldn't be making a visit to Jillian until at least Monday, unless he made an exception to his no working on weekends rule. But McCoy couldn't imagine that things had changed that much, so he had a few days anyway. He went home. Uncle Roy was sitting on the front porch. Despite the overcast skies, the day was warm, and the old man rocked slowly in his rocking chair. Chatty was in his lap, and Bubbles lay at his feet. They didn't stir when McCoy trudged up the stairs, so he guessed they'd spent the morning practicing the tricks that Jillian was teaching them and running around. Bone-weary after being up all night with the cockfighting ring lead, he would just toss and turn if he tried to go to sleep, so he slumped against the post and slid down until he sat on the edge of the steps, one leg bent in front of him, one braced on the second step. "Rough day?" Uncle Roy asked. "And it's only half over. Looks like yours was exciting. Dogs are spent anyway." "Yep, been working on the things that Twisty's taught us." Uncle Roy flashed his dentures. "She's a good kid. Kinda seems like she likes you, too." He smirked, and McCoy wondered if he'd seen their embrace this morning, if not the kiss, which had been entirely too short as far as he was concerned. Too short, but the best kiss he'd ever had. "Both of you seemed upset when you left this morning." "Yeah." Uncle Roy rocked in silence for a while. Finally, he shifted, patting the head of the dog on his lap. "You want to talk about it?" "I can't, really." But he could. Uncle Roy wouldn't tell anyone. He studied the hand that hung over his knee. She's not an American citizen. So? Uncle Roy asked. Uncle Roy didn't understand. She's not here legally. Oh. He rubbed the dog's head absently, his rocking chair keeping its slow rhythm. McCoy ran a hand over his head, then looked out over the greening grass. After his fiancée told him he was boring, he'd figured that was the end for him. It was easy to see she was right. He wasn't a big party guy. He didn't find flaunting authority exciting or interesting, and he'd just as soon stay home as go out. Girls wouldn't find him interesting, and that was fine. But he couldn't deny he'd wanted someone to share things with, to be with him, to love him. Someone to work alongside of him, someone to talk to, someone he could look at and admire, who he could run his eyes over their body and know it was his to touch at any time. Someone who would touch him. He closed his eyes. The need for Jillian to touch him made his skin prick. He hadn't realized how much he'd longed for that human contact. Not just any human. He wanted Jillian's hands, her lips, her body touching his. Her smile in the morning, her laughter all day long. He had to quit torturing himself. So marry her. Huh? McCoy said, jerking out of his thoughts. Marry her? Marry her. Does that automatically make her legal? He couldn't believe it would be that easy. How could I anyway? Don't you need your birth certificate? He rubbed his neck. He hadn't been thinking about marriage. He wasn't even sure Jillian liked him that much. But maybe it was a possibility, a far distant one. I don't know. Guys who were in the service with me did it. Married girls they met overseas and brought them home as their wife. I guess I'd have to ask a lawyer about it. That sounds too simple. McCoy leaned his head back against the post and closed his eyes. Marriage was out of the question. He couldn't believe he was even thinking of going to a lawyer's. Although, if he had a little bit of time, marriage might not be so bad. Except, he didn't really want Jillian marrying him so she could become a citizen, especially if she didn't really like him and considered him boring. By Sunday night, McCoy knew he'd put off telling Jillian long enough. He hadn't seen her since she kissed him, then left. Not that he'd expected her to look him up. It was probably his responsibility to make the next move in their relationship. Did they have a relationship? He wasn't sure. In his book, they did. That kiss made it a relationship. That wasn't something he went around doing with just anyone. Jillian was special. Special in herself. Special to him. But he couldn't deny he was leery. He wasn't any more interesting now than he was, and although he'd chatted with a lawyer over the phone and marrying someone who wasn't a U.S. citizen was a little more complicated than it sounded, it could be done, although probably not in time to get her a permit for Heidi. But he didn't want her marrying him just to gain citizenship status. But if he cared for her, should it matter whether she used him or not? Shouldn't he be willing to sacrifice for her, even if his feelings weren't returned? Or were his feelings contingent on hers? Navigating the tricky world of feelings was a lot harder than seeing the solid black lines of rules and following them. He drove his truck slowly down the drive toward her house, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. He wasn't great at taking risks, and seeing Jillian today felt like a risk. Getting her number from Fink or Gator had been something he'd considered, but that felt like the easy way out. He needed to face her. 4 days had been long enough without seeing her. She was sitting on her porch step, Snickers at her feet. His eyes roamed over her as he drove the last distance and parked. She wore jeans that stopped mid-calf and a flowy peasant-type white blouse, which emphasized her dark skin and contrasted with her black hair that fell in a shiny waterfall over her shoulder. The neck on the blouse was big and fell over, exposing one bare shoulder. His eyes traced the smooth curve of her skin. It would taste like honey and spices, he was sure of it. He sat for a moment in his pickup, gripping the wheel. He couldn't think about tasting her skin, or even touching it. He had things to tell her, and he needed to focus on giving information. But as he looked at her, sitting there with her hand on her dog, he couldn't help but remember her determination to work with blistered hands, her care for her animals, how she burnt their food. That last thought made him smile, and he got out of his pickup. He walked to the front of it and leaned against the grill, leaving a good 10 feet between them. "You have a minute?" he asked. She tilted her head, looking at him like she'd expected something more. They weren't exactly on terms where he would greet her with a kiss, were they? "Yes," she said softly, her hand moving on Snickers' fur. "My boss took me off your case." She snorted a quick laugh without humor. "You told him that we kissed?" He searched her face. He couldn't tell if the idea that he might have been honest bothered her or not. He hoped it didn't. "No." Her black eyes snapped to his. "That's not something I'd go around telling people about, even if it was the thing he'd most thought about. All week. More. He wanted more." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "Todd found a circus who will buy your elephant. That impressed Louis." "That might be a good thing." Her eyes looked straight ahead, staring at nothing while she rolled that over in her head. "Could be, although sounded to me like Todd was going to find some infraction against you, take the elephant and then sell it himself, getting the money for our department, which is constantly underfunded. It was a pet peeve of his that Philly got the lion's share of Pennsylvania's tax money. The little that was spared for animal control was spread thin." Jillian continued to stare out across the field. "I'm not looking to get money out of her, but that would mean she'd never be reunited with her sister." "You hear from the man who has her?" He didn't want to ask, but he needed to. "Yes." Her chin tilted up and she looked square at him. "He'll take her if I go with her." His body froze, and the world seemed to stop around him. Their eyes clashed, hers defiant, and his. Heck, he didn't know what his might look like. Devastated, maybe. Desperate, probably. Pleading, most definitely. She couldn't kiss him with such power and emotion and then move 8,000 miles away. Oh, yes, she could. He had no claim on her at all. "Walk with me?" he asked softly. She swallowed and looked down. He thought she was going to refuse, but then she stood, gracefully, straightening. Pulling his hands out of his pockets, he pushed off from the grill of his truck. "I always feel like such a clod beside you." Her brows tilted down. "Why?" "Because you move with such elegance and grace." His heart hammered, but he let the words in his heart slip off his tongue. "I could watch you all day long and never get tired of your beauty and poise." I see that you watch me. I can't not watch you. She'd stopped in front of him. His mind and heart waged a short battle. His heart won because he reached out and took her hand, watching her face, hoping that was acceptance in her eyes. His rough hand slid over her lissom fingers, sweet and sensuous as they bent and curved together. Her chest moved as she took a shaky breath. We can walk around the pond. It's pretty in the moonlight and the peepers are singing. He could hear them now that she mentioned it, could hear the breeze rustle the pines, which scented the air with their fragrance. I'll follow. He wasn't a very good follower, never had been, but Jillian seemed to carry his heart. I wasn't sure I'd see you again, she said as she stepped out. Her body flowed easily beside him. Why? He couldn't imagine not seeing her again. I felt like you'd never talk to me again once you realized I snuck in. Her head stayed straight ahead, like she was afraid to look at him. Or maybe she was just trying to make sure of where she was going as the sun disappeared behind the mountain. I know I put you in a bad spot. He heard her, but he didn't really want to talk about that. He was more concerned about whether or not she was actually going to move to Brazil. Would this night be their last night together? She seemed to be waiting for him to say something, though. He didn't want to tell her of his struggle, how he wanted to follow the law, but, for the first time in his life, was thinking about letting his emotions rule his decision. Not completely. He'd talked to that lawyer. I realized I didn't care. He'd come to the conclusion that being here unlawfully was wrong, but he didn't think that Jillian was normally a lawbreaker. He couldn't feel for her so deeply if he believed that about her. Really? Surprise laced her tone. I can't believe that. Maybe it's not entirely true. I do care, but only because of the hurdles it places between me and you. Her eyes widened. He'd said, twice now, things that allowed her to glimpse what he was feeling for her, but she hadn't responded in kind. He wasn't going to wait around. If she were thinking of going to Brazil, he didn't have time to be slow. He waited until they stopped a few yards away from the pond. He turned her to face him. Is there a you and me, Jillian? Do you want there to be? That wasn't what I asked. You haven't talked to me for 4 days. I left the next day and was up north until Friday. It wasn't an excuse, and he knew it. She didn't even call him on it. Instead, she prompted. Yesterday? It took me that long to figure out what I could live with. It was a bad choice of words, and he knew it as soon as they came out of his mouth. Her face scrunched up, and she turned away. I don't want to be someone you have to convince yourself you can live with. She wrapped her arms around her body and stared out at the pond. He didn't know how to get himself out of that hole, so he asked something safer. Tell me about your childhood. I grew up in the circus. She shrugged, like it was no big deal. Maybe it wasn't to her, since it was her normal. It was just my mom and me. She's still in Mexico, married with young kids. I guess she was just a kid herself when she had me, but it didn't seem like that growing up. He wanted to touch her, to put his arm around her, but there was something else he felt he needed to ask first. Is there anything else that maybe someone who was too stupid to talk to you for 4 days after you kissed him might need to know before he grovels and apologizes and begs you to kiss him again?" She smiled, and his heart did a small flip. "I have a lot of secrets, McCoy." "I'm sorry I didn't try to talk to you before this. I could have gotten your number. I could have come yesterday. Even Friday night, it wasn't that late when I got home." He balled his hands into fists so he wouldn't trace the curve of her neck, the edge of her blouse, thread his fingers through her hair. "You're all I thought about for the last 4 days. I longed with every breath I took to see you again. But I didn't know, I still don't, if there's any future for us." "Does it matter?" she asked softly. The breeze lifted strands of her hair and blew them across her face. She turned back to him. It did. Of course it mattered. He wasn't the kind of guy who just what? Had a fling? Played the field? God forbid, a one-night stand? No way. He didn't operate like that. Never had. Maybe that made him boring. He didn't care. "Yes." His voice was low but fierce. "Yes, it matters. I don't go around kissing whatever girl strikes my fancy, or whatever girl will let me, or however guys do those things." He closed the distance between them. "I don't live to gratify myself today and have no regard for tomorrow and its consequences. A casual indifference to the person I'm with. Indulge and move on? No." She blinked at him like he'd just sprouted a second head. "You don't date?" That question totally took the wind out of his sails, and he turned away, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "I was engaged once, back when I was in college. We were pretty serious in making plans, but she went to study in Europe for a year. She left my ring there and brought a guy back with her." He turned and met her eyes. "She told me I was predictable and boring. That, and the fact that she obviously cheated on me, made me decide it was better to be alone." "You're not boring." Words he wanted to hear, maybe needed to hear. Actually, I think she was right. I enjoy having guidelines written down, something I can see so I know where the boundary is. That's boring. "That's hard, to live in bounds." She gave a humorless laugh. He thought of the boundary she had crossed, a country's boundary. "I might have a solution to your problem." "Oh?" "Marry me." Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.